I am really excited to talk about the ACC as someone who grew up in the Northeast, now lives in the Southeast. I mean, it's for me, it's like going from the tip to the other tip of this conference. I grew up watching the Syracuse Orangemen, yeah, really liking them, that team, really, watching, enjoying them. And then now, the North Carolina Duke rivalry. I think that my brother is a huge Duke fan. So when I grew up in high school, I bought a North Carolina Tar Heels hat just because. So, and I mean, growing up in Western New York, you didn't really know that. I knew that just enough that it pissed my brother off. So I did that. So he's still a Duke fan. So you'll probably hear me still talk a little bit of crap about Duke, but I'm actually really impressed at that team this year. So maybe you'll hear some love. Who knows? Regardless, the ACC championship game did not go as planned last year. Virginia Tech took care of Duke last year in an interesting fashion. It was a pretty interesting conference to say the least. A lot of big teams in this conference. A lot of interesting teams. Honestly, I would say out of the 14 teams here, you could really make a strong opinion that 9 or 10 of them could really be a front runner for this conference. What do you think, Steve?
I had 9 written down. I know most publications and most things you look at, I think they give them either 6 or 7 tournament bids coming up, as they're trying to project out. And of course, it'll be wrong. But I mean, it's still fun at this time of the year to kind of guess what that field of 68 is going to be. They have probably the most exciting player in the country, and Terquavion Smith at North Carolina State. And North Carolina State might just be a middle of the conference team. I mean, they're certainly worthy of consideration because they have Smith. He could single-handedly get them into the NCAA tournament. But that's the nice thing about the ACC. It lengthens the discussion when you have a conference like the ACC. There are teams that we know are going to struggle: Pitt, Georgia Tech, Clemson. I think Boston College is going to struggle. I think Syracuse needs to retool. But still, even knowing that you've got those teams that would they'll be like bottom feeders for the top echelon, there are, like you said, 9 or 10 teams that every week you've got to look at the schedule and say, well, gee, who's Wake Forest playing this week? Or where is Louisville on the road this week? Or are they home? And then you have to take a look at it and say, okay, well, now how is that going to affect where these teams are going to ultimately slot going first into the ACC tournament? And then you always have at least one, if not 2, great upsets in the ACC tournament. And that directly impacts the NCAA brackets. So you had a team like Virginia last year, for example, that had a disappointing 21-win season and got bounced in the NIT. They were a tournament caliber team. They just didn't finish strong, and they didn't have a good ACC tournament. So this is the kind of league where it's not going to just be a handful or half a handful of teams that you really need to pay attention to. It's every week, every game. Once conference play starts, something is going to happen that's going to ultimately impact what we look at in March.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw Coach K, we're going to talk about that in just a second. He lost his last 2 against North Carolina. We know that's going to sting for a long time. We saw in the ACC championship tournament that Virginia Tech, who won it all, almost lost in the middle rounds to Clemson. They won on a last-second shot. So anything can happen in this conference. I think this is one of those conferences that you got to pay a very close attention to. I think this is one of the best conferences in all of basketball, if not the best. I think that deserves the argument 100%. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to give you a quick preview of the ACC. We're not going to get in all 14 teams because that would take a long time. Throughout the season on the YouTube page, we will dig into some of the other teams and give you some quick recaps and stuff. But for the podcast, for the ACC preview, we're going to dig into what we call the first 4, and then we're going to give you our sleeper to round out our starting 5. So we're going to break down 5 teams that we think can really make a difference in the ACC and maybe throughout the NCAA tournament and maybe a possible national championship bid, or at least the Final 4. We're going to give you our thoughts on that. I don't know if we'll go that far into it, but we're going to really dig into the preview. And the first one I feel like we got to start off with, Steve, is a team that made the Final 4 last year. and that's North Carolina Tar Heels. I mean, there's a debate that this is not just the number one team in the ACC. This is the number one team in the country. You know, they bring back some of their best players, especially one of the best big men in the country, and Armando Bacot. I mean, he was leading the team last year with 16 points per game, 13 rebounds per game. He was a very good player last year, set an NCAA record, but 6 double-doubles in the NCAA tournament. He decided to not enter the NBA draft, come back for one more year. That is a huge advantage for the Tar Heels. He's joined by a pretty decent backcourt duo in Love and Davis. I really like what the Tar Heels got going for him this year. I think that we can see a step up with the Tar Heels, which is something that actually possible? Yeah, I do think so. That's the case. What's your thoughts on the North Carolina Tar Heels?
North Carolina is one of those programs that everybody works harder to find fault with than they do pointing out what a great program that it is. They're not flashy. You know, they do everything well, but it's so seamless and they're so well coached that it's like, well, I don't. What are you seeing in North Carolina that we're not, that we analytics geeks aren't seeing, in this team? I'll add a Puff Johnson to the backcourt discussion. Each of their guards do something special. I don't want to say unique, but they each have their roles. I love me some Caleb Love. He is one of the best guards in the country. Again, is he going to be a guy that's going to be first, first ACC? Maybe not. But, you take him out of the equation. If he gets hurt or, pulls a hamstring or sprains an ankle and he's not around, it's going to change how this North Carolina team operates. I mean, you talked about, Bacot. He's going to dominate on the boards. The great thing about North Carolina, and this is pretty much their story almost all of the time, depth overcomes your injuries. Depth overcomes a tough early start in the first half of a ball game. Depth answers the questions come March. And that's why people have North Carolina as the number one team in the country, in many, many rankings. I can't say that I agree. I have a team that we'll talk about a little bit later on in this preview that I honestly think is the best team in the country. And it's not in the ACC. It is in the Big East. But North Carolina, okay, you can take ink and put them in the Final Four. It's not pencil them in. A lot of things have to go wrong, and more from an injury standpoint. I mean, they're going to gel. They got up to a bad start last year by North Carolina standards. I don't think that's going to happen this year. Everything, as the season went on, they gelled and they really, I think, found themselves in the NCAA tournament last year, and that's going to carry over. I mean, momentum does carry over in college basketball where it does not in most other collegiate sports. Basketball, you have a late season rush or a late season improvement, that does carry over when those players come back. So North Carolina, don't sleep on them. I mean, and if you do, shame on you.
North Carolina was 29-10 last year. To me, that was incredible. I think that's something they really got to pay attention to. Second year for Hubert Davis. I think that's another thing to look into. Obviously had a fantastic first year as coach after Roy Williams. Big shoes to fill for the Tar Heels, something that really worked out for the Tar Heels in the last few decades. Roy Williams after their spin. There was a few mix-ups before Roy Williams came in, so there was obviously some skepticism on how Davis would do. He did a fantastic job.
Yes.
Is he going to do that again this year? Do you see that changing? Do you see him improving? I know you talk about maybe sophomore slumps with players. Is that a thing with coaches? What's your thoughts on that one before we move on?
I guess you could say that coaches, after the honeymoon, after that first year, things kind of get more stressed, and you notice, you nitpick. Wait a minute, I didn't notice that, he did this, or, why does he slurp his soup or whatever? I mean, there's all those things you see after the honeymoon. Hubert Davis could walk into any locker room, whether it be at the collegiate level or at the professional level, and command the room the minute he walks through the door. So even if he makes questionable decisions or, early in the year, I think there's going to be some tinkering as far as combinations and how they want to do things. And maybe they lose a game they shouldn't to a non-conference team. I mean, it happens. Hubert Davis, the ACC is a conference where coaches matter. Okay, Mike Krzyzewski, Roy Williams, Hubert Davis, Steve Forbes at Wake Forest, Leonard Hamilton at Florida State. You can go pretty much all the way through the ACC, and the coach matters. Even on the weaker teams, the coach has the respect of his players, and the coach matters. So I think to try to dismiss, again, I think it's something that people more nitpick about. And I mean, and you and I read many of the same articles. I think they're just trying to find a way to knock North Carolina down. It's sort of like, to use a baseball analogy, people want to knock down the Dodgers or the Yankees, or at the professional level, they don't want the Lakers to be good. They want to find fault with the Lakers or the Celtics. They just want to pick apart teams that year in, year out pretty much get the job done. So I think if you're worried about Hubert Davis, you probably should start some medicines, because you really don't need to be worried about that.
You talk that coaches are very important in this conference, and we just said goodbye to probably the best coach that has ever coached the game of basketball at any level. And that's Coach K for the Duke Blue Devils. He goes 42 years and decides to hang it up. How selfish, right? But now he has longtime assistant John Shire taking the reins. This seems like a very good selection. Now, we know that there has been some conversations in the past that maybe he would hang it up early when he had some surgeries. I know even at one time, Coach K said he was going to resign, but the university said, no, that's not going to happen. This was inevitable. We knew this was happening. John Shire is going to be the first shot at it post Coach K. I'm sure that they're hoping that they can get 42 years out of this guy as well. I've seen him in press conferences. He speaks well. He seems confident. You could tell initially he was a little scared, but he's figuring it out. He's exposing himself a little more to some questions that you wouldn't see Coach K do, but I think that just comes to experience. I wouldn't hold that against him. But I'm actually really excited to see how he does. I think that's going to be a fun storyline to talk about all season. We're not going to be the only podcast or any show that talks about John Shire all year. Looking at this Blue Devils team, though, this isn't the only thing that's changing as the coach. This entire team is changing. This is the new aspect with Duke. We've seen this in and year out with this new one and done rule. Duke has took that wholeheartedly and ran with it. They have bought in on the one in and one outs, or 1 year, one done, and they run away with it. But it worked for them last year, 32-7 in the entire league. In conference, they're 16-4. It worked. They got the ACC championship. They got to pretty far in the NCAA tournament. It works. Now you look at this team, they're predicted to be either first or second in the ACC and make a pretty decent run in the NCAA tournament, with the only returning starter in Jeremy Roach, who will be their captain, by the way. Seems like a fantastic guy. But when you only have one returning starter and a whole bunch of freshmen, now don't get me wrong, the number 1 overall freshman prospect, number 2 overall freshman prospect coming in, and Derek Lively, and you got Kyle Flapowski, and Derek, just lost Derek's last name. Whitehead. There you go. Derek Whitehead. I mean, you have some very good players coming in, but none of them are proven. It's a huge risk that Duke's taken. So in the past, it's worked. But every year you have to ask the question, will it work again?
Well, I think it's ideal to work in this situation, because you're eliminating any question. Well, Coach K used this guy in this role, and he thought this guy was better coming off the bench than being a starter. It's a brand new beginning for Duke. They're not going to go into a rebuild mode and be at the bottom of the ACC. That's probably never, ever, ever going to happen again. Shire is coming in. These are his guys for the most part. He was heavily involved in the recruiting over the last couple of seasons. So it's a perfect time to have a roster turnover. And when you can have a guy like Derek Lively, who basically he's the ultimate teammate. I mean, he's a taller version of Grant Hill, I would say, from how everybody's described him. Wonderful teammate, smart, good on-court presence, just ridiculous athletic prowess. You add him to Roach, you add him to some of the other guys. The guy that Duke fans should take a look at is the guy that transferred in from Harvard. And Cale Catchus, that guy can shoot. He is going to answer a lot of questions as we get deeper into the season. Who's going to be there to hit the big shot? He is the guy. I'm a huge Ivy League fan and follower. He is special. I didn't understand, other than the education, why he was in the Ivy League. Going to a school with the academic reputation of Duke, okay, it makes a sense, to go into the transfer portal and go ahead and do that. Duke will be fine. It's like anything. Are there going to be blips? Of course there are. And when you're following a legend, it doesn't matter. I mean, Roy Williams went through that, having to follow legends both at Kansas and in North Carolina. It happens. I mean, you just have to eventually get over it. We'll give you 1 year, Duke fans and college basketball fans, to get over Mike Krzyzewski, because his legacy is forever. It's not just while he was coaching. And it is interesting to note, Shire's 34, Krzyzewski was 33 when he came from Army to take over Duke. And people had the same kind of questions. Well, it's a completely new roster, and how is he going to be able to compete? And this is an Army. Krzyzewski anointed him just like Knight anointed Krzyzewski as being the next big thing as far as a college basketball coach is. And I think both Knight's prediction was correct. Krzyzewski was probably the greatest college basketball coach in my lifetime. And I've been around a long time. And I remember John Wooden. I mean, I vividly remember those UCLA teams. Krzyzewski was a better coach and better, not a better person, but his impact was just, it's immeasurable in college basketball. Shiro will be fine. Krzyzewski knows this is the guy that can come into that institution. And remember, even with the one and dones, to a degree, it plays to Duke's favor because their academic standards are so stringent. If a player is a borderline academic admission at Duke, maybe 1 year and he would be forced to go on academic probation or whatever it would be. So it does play for him that way. But I think overall, Duke, it's not really going to miss a beat. It's going to look different. It's going to feel different. But at the end of the day, in March, Duke is going to be there.
One thing to keep in mind, Shire is taking over a 32-17. When Coach K took over, he came from Army with a losing record that year. Army had a losing record. I know many people were upset that Coach K was coming to coach Duke after having a losing record for West Point. Well, that worked out pretty well for them. All right, let's talk about the next one on our first four, number 3 here, and that's the Miami Hurricanes. I think they had probably one of the biggest turnarounds in college basketball last year. They had a fantastic trio. Really only one of those are coming back, and that's Isaiah Wong. He had 15 points per game last year, and he had 10 games where he had at least 20 or more. I really like Wong in this situation. I also like, and you're going to hear me say this a lot, I follow the Sun Belt quite closely, but you're getting one of the best transfers from the Sun Belt. You're getting the Sun Belt Player of the Year from last year, Norchad Omier from Arkansas State. Miami, what I like about this team is that they're not afraid to tell you that they're going to go out and look at the different rosters from the ACC, and they're going to see how they can match up against you. And then they're going to decide what kind of basketball they're going to play. They said that all last season. It worked out for them. They turned their team around. They're not afraid to do that again. They're going to see what kind of roster they have. They're going to line it up against the rest of the teams in the ACC, and then they're going to decide, are they going to stretch you out? Are they going to play you down low? This team is dynamic, and that is something that you can't say about some of these other teams we just mentioned. I think that they have a very unique skill set that is going to make them be one of those scary teams all the way up through March, maybe April. Steve, that's how far I really like this Miami Hurricanes team. A lot to be excited about on this one.
Overrated.
Oh, all right.
Overrated.
So there's our first disagree. Okay.
And then you might want to take your headphones off when I say this.
All right. Go ahead. Give it to me.
Norchid Ormian is going to learn very early on that the ACC is not the Sun Belt. In a 1 or 2 game bracket in a tournament, perhaps you can shine and show what you got. In the ACC, a much more rugged conference, a much more competitive conference, night in, night out. You're gonna, unless you're coming to Pittsburgh or Georgia Tech, you really do have to put your max effort in every single night. I don't think that his potential is going to come out at Miami. Miami, year in, year out, struggles with consistent play in the front court. That's why that's a very important addition through the transfer portal. But I mean, Miami eventually, and they talk a good game. Oh, we're going to beat you at your own game, but they really don't have the depth, and their front court gets pushed around in big games. So is Miami a tournament team? I think they're a bubble team. I mean, odds are they probably will make the NCAA tournament, especially if they do okay in the ACC tournament. But I don't see what everybody else is seeing here in Miami. They could quite possibly shut me up come January and February. But I have a pretty good feeling, just like on my baseball podcast adventures, I always hold back that I told you so until the end of the year and then play that card and sit smugly and say, told you so. I think that's going to be the case of Miami. Do they have enough talent? Do they have the talent to be really, really good and surprise us again? Yeah, but I don't think that they are better than some of the other teams we're going to still talk about here in the ACC. And I think at best, they're a bubble team.
All right. Well, there's the first one I got to write down to see what you have for I told you so's. All right, cool. I'm glad we don't agree on everything, because that would make a very boring show. It'd make a very boring show. So I'm a lot higher on Miami than you are. We just determined that one. Good to hear. It seems like we're pretty much in the same pace with UNC and Duke, though. It's really hard not to be. All right, Here we go. With our final first 4 here, the number 4 team that we're going to talk about in the ACC today is UVA, the Cavaliers. Tony Bennett, one of the most interesting coaches. I mean, you were talking about coaches that mean a lot in the conference. I know you didn't mean to forget his name, but he's one that really needs to be talked about. Tony Bennett at the helm has really changed this team and has turned this team into a top-notch championship caliber basketball team year in and year out. Now, the last few years haven't been exactly the UVA basketball that we've seen in years past in winning wise, but they've still produced some top-notch defense. They have been one of the best defenses in the ACC year in and year out. The problem is, Steve, is even though they're doing great on defensive, they can't score. They're having a hard time scoring the basketball. They are returning 5 starters this year, and they brought in a really nice transfer from Ohio, actually a guard that beat them in the March Madness back in 2020. So 2020. So really interesting on that one. That was a really cool interview listening to Tony Bennett talk about bringing him in and saying practices are pretty fun every time he misses a shot. He says, how come he couldn't do that against us in the NCAA tournament? So pretty neat. But, getting the 5th-year starter guard, Kai Clark, that's obviously where this team wraps around is through Clark. And if Clark can find a way to get this team to score more, and they don't have to score by a lot because their defense is shut down. They have to just win ball games. 12-8 in the conference was pretty impressive, though. When you look at that, based on the the rest of the conference and how they sat. They did sit 6th in the conference. Not terrible. Not terrible at all. I like UVA. Are you going to clap your hands and tell me these guys are overrated too? Because I'm pretty high on these guys as well.
No, in fact, when we were talking about who we were going to put in here, I was very insistent that UVA has to be part of the equation. You touched on two of the things. I didn't leave Bennett out. I was saving him
Fair.
for when we were talking about the Cavaliers. He makes adjustments as well in game and at halftime as any coach in the country, let alone the ACC. Clark, he's gutsy. He's a veteran. He knows how to get the ball to the players that are going to score. And you talked about Vanderplas from Ohio. I'm so high on that kid that I almost wore my Ohio Bobcat shirt and not my Duquesne Duke shirt here for our initial podcast, because that's how much of a difference maker I think that he can be, and he can play defense. All of these guys that potentially are going to improve their scoring with another year under their belt and just as they mature, and they play good defense. You can add that to every single player on the Cavalier roster. I don't think that there's a bad defender, unless you had to take a coach off the bench and put him in due to injury or illness or something. I mean, it's always, and they play great defense. And that makes so much of a difference in today's NCAA, because so many teams play good enough defense to win, but they don't focus and they don't take pride in the effort on the defensive end of the game. And I think that's what makes Virginia dangerous. Now, they went to the NIT last year, right? They didn't make the NCAA field. Am I correct on that? Or
that's right. And this is where I get to plug in my roots here.
Okay.
And they lost to St. Bonaventure.
I was setting the alley-oop
in the semifinals, though.
Yes,
it was a good game.
Yeah. Oh no. Oh yeah. No, absolutely. I think people. I'm trying to find a way to say this without talking down to the analytics crowd and without talking down to people that like to see the flashy part. And all that is great. And it's fun when you're watching a game in December or January and seeing all these alley-oops and all these stars behind the back and, people drilling, 6 or 7 threes in a row. That's all exciting. It's all about, as Herm Edwards used to famously say, you have to win. You play to win the game. You have to win the game. And that's what Virginia does, perhaps better than anyone in the conference, because they have to pay attention to every small detail to keep pace with the North Carolinas and the Dukes and any of the high octane teams. North Carolina State, who probably will not be a tournament team, but they've got that transcendent talent. Virginia, for an old school basketball fan like myself, those are the teams I love to watch.
They play their game, and
Yes.
They make their opponent play their game. And that's why they did so well, even with maybe a roster that wasn't as talented as some of the others in the ACC last year. Now they bring most of them back, another year under their belt. They're going to be more experienced. You'd assume that talent's only going up, not down. They brought in a great transfer from Ohio. I like this team. If they can find a way to improve their shooting percentage just a little bit and obviously continue their top-notch defense, this team is not going to be 12-8 in the conference. This is a 14-15 win team in the conference. That's how I feel about this team when it comes to that. All right, let's talk about our sleeper team in the ACC. And Steve, I'm going to let you start off with this one, as I know that you're dying to talk about this team because you had to make sure these got in here.
Well, yet Notre Dame, now that Mike Krzyzewski is gone, Mike Bray is the best coach in the ACC, and that is a mouthful, because as we've talked about this entire preview, coaching matters in this conference. And the teams that don't have the coaches that connect with their players and get the most and get the best out of their players, they don't succeed. Mike Bray somehow, some way, finds a way to not only tap into what each player can contribute, but somehow weave it in to, a tapestry that ultimately looks good as it goes up into the Raptors. That's the kind of coach that Mike Bray is. That's the kind of team that Notre Dame is. Notre Dame can beat you if they put their mind to it defensively. They can beat you trying to score. They can beat you in the half court. They, thanks to their coach and the players buying into the system, and he recruits specific kind of players. That's why Notre Dame always has to be in the conversation in the ACC.
Notre Dame is one of those teams that are very interesting to pay attention to, because you can look at these players and this team in several different ways. And I think this is why it makes them a really good sleeper. Now, obviously, they were 15-5 last year in the conference. That was good enough for tied for second, with UNC. So, I mean, they were great last year. However, they did lose arguably two of their best players, Blake Wesley, Paul Atkinson's Jr. But then you look on the flip side, they return 5 seniors, and 4 of them are super seniors. So they are one of the oldest teams in the country. That means they have a lot of experience on the Virginia side. They're obviously nowhere this type of play like Virginia. But when you look at that experience and you look at what they can do and what they did last year, it's hard to not put them into the conversation. Because although they did lose Wesley, and that is a huge blow, let's put that up.
Killer.
Yeah, that is something that we need to keep in mind here, that this team is not the same team, even though they are bringing back a decent amount of their squad. Wesley was a huge asset of why they went 24-11 last year and 15-5 in the conference. But yes, they do deserve to be in credit here. This is why they're a great category for the sleeper to start off this ACC preview, because in our minds right now, that means that they could be the 5th place team, 4th place team. They could really make a run in the ACC.
Yeah, they're the kind of team that can win the tournament because, again, they buy in to what their coach is preaching and selling. They did bring in a secret weapon, once again, bragging on my Metro Atlantic conference. Marcus Hammond from Niagara. He's a taller version of Calvin Murphy. And a lot of you younger kids don't probably even know who Calvin Murphy is. He may have been, outside of maybe Louis Dampier, who played in the ABA with the Kentucky Colonels, the purest shooter I have ever seen. Hammond is a taller version because Calvin Murphy was like 5. I think he listed at 5'9". I think he was like 5'5", 5'6". Hammond's 6'3". He can shoot it from anywhere. I mean, I kept expecting him at Niagara to pull up at the half court line just because he could and drill a 3. I mean, it's better that he got closer to drill the 3, but it wouldn't surprise me if he pulled up at the half court line because he saw something, drilled the 3, and then got the team back on defense. He is going to be the secret weapon for Notre Dame because when they need a big bucket, Hammond's going to be able to deliver it. He's not Blake Wesley. There aren't many players in the ACC that are Blake Wesley, but Hammond is going to make a huge difference in Notre Dame, and that's why I was so insistent on saying there are sleeper. And there were other choices. You mentioned Virginia Tech. I think Wake Forest. I think Steve Forbes has really put together a nice roster. But I think Notre Dame, of all of the teams that I just mentioned, is the team that, yes, they're the sleeper. I think they could win the ACC tournament. That just the way they're constructed, if everything comes together as Bray expects it to, I think they win the ACC tournament.
Really, it wouldn't be anything that you'd be like, wow, like shocked about. We saw Virginia Tech win it last year. And just like you said, other teams that would deserve this, Virginia Tech, Wake Forest, I agree. Florida State most definitely would be in this in this run here. Just because we didn't talk about them doesn't mean we don't think highly of them. we're keeping this pretty short here, trying to get as many previews as we can to you. If you are one of those fans, hit us up in the comments. Let us know. We want to hear a preview on this team if we didn't touch your ACC, or if you are a fan of a team we touched and you want us to cover them even more, let us know in the comments, and we'll make sure that we get you a in-depth one-on-one team preview on our YouTube.